Nobody in that stadium was ready. They couldn't have been ready, because nobody expected it. Nobody could have imagined it. But when they saw the man standing on the mound, 38 years old, 15 years later, the same stance, the same look, they felt something. Something funny and something frightening at the same time. Then the first pitch was thrown, and that feeling passed. Something else took its place. Something deeper, something quieter. They were watching, and they were understanding. The thing they thought would not happen was happening. And Babe Ruth, standing on a pitcher's mound for the first time in 15 years, was throwing a baseball at major league hitters and getting them out. The story begins earlier, not on the mound, in the dugout. Ruth had been having the kind of morning that 38-year-old baseball players have when the body has started presenting its accounting. The knees, the eyes, the timing that had been automatic for 20 years and now required a fraction of a second more than it once had. He was sitting in the Yankees dugout before the game, watching, thinking. Manager Joe McCarthy was nearby. McCarthy was a serious man, a professional, the kind of manager who planned carefully and did not do things for spectacle or entertainment. He said something to Ruth. What exactly he said has been told differently in different accounts. The version that baseball settled on, the version that feels true, whether or not it is literally true, is that McCarthy said something like, "If you're feeling restless, babe, you could always go pitch." The way you say something when you don't mean it. The way you say something to a man who is 40 pounds heavier than he was in his prime, and whose pitching career ended before most of the men on this roster were adults. Ruth looked at him. McCarthy saw something in that look. Something that made him stop. Something that said the comment was no longer a comment. It was an idea, and Ruth was taking it seriously. Ruth had not pitched in a major league game since 1933, was still early when the conversation happened. He had not pitched in a meaningful sense since 1921, had not taken a mound with the full intention of pitching a complete game since 1918, when he was 23 years old and one of the best left-handed pitchers in the American League. 15 years. In those 15 years, he had hit 700 home runs, had won 4 World Series championships, had become the most famous athlete in America, had transformed the sport in ways that were still being absorbed. The pitcher he had been was not forgotten. It was simply buried under the accumulated weight of everything the hitter he became had produced. When people thought of Ruth, they thought of the swing, of the home runs, of the number that had been settled in their minds as the definition of what Ruth was. The pitcher Ruth had been was a historical footnote, a curiosity, the thing he was before he became the thing he would be remembered as. And now Ruth was looking at McCarthy with an expression that said he wanted to go back, for one afternoon, to the thing he had been before. McCarthy agreed. He agreed the way managers agree to things when the player asking is Babe Ruth, and the request is unusual, but not dangerous, and the game's outcome is not in serious jeopardy. He agreed the way you agree when you understand that saying no is not actually one of your options. Ruth went to warm up. What the bullpen catcher felt when Ruth started throwing, when the arm came through with the motion that had been dormant for 15 years, and the ball went where Ruth was pointing it, has not been recorded. But something in that warm-up was convincing enough that McCarthy let it proceed, sent Ruth to the mound, announced the lineup, and Babe Ruth, 38 years old and 15 years removed from pitching, took the mound at Yankee Stadium. The opposing hitters knew. They knew before the first pitch. Word travels fast in baseball. The information that Babe Ruth was going to pitch moved through the visiting dugout the way unusual information moves. Quickly, with a mixture of disbelief and the specific anticipation of professional athletes who understand that something unusual is about to happen and want to see it. They had faced Ruth from the other side, had stood in the batter's box and tried to hit the ball he was trying to hit. Now they were going to stand in the batter's box and try to hit the ball he was trying to throw. The dynamic was completely reversed. Ruth was no longer the man they had prepared for. He was the man they were completely unprepared for. Because nobody had prepared to hit against Babe Ruth pitching. Nobody had done that in 15 years. First inning, Ruth threw. The mechanics were not what they had been in 1918. Could not have been. The body had changed too much. The arm had not been used in this way in too long. But something was still there. The fastball that had once been his primary weapon was not the fastball of his youth. Was not 90 miles per hour. Was something less. But it moved. Had the late action that good fastballs have regardless of velocity. And the hitters, who had come to the plate expecting to feast on what they assumed was a nostalgic experiment, discovered that the experiment was more serious than they had expected. Ruth was not throwing batting practice. Ruth was pitching. The distinction matters. Pitching is not throwing hard. Pitching is understanding hitters. Is knowing what they want to hit and not giving it to them. Is sequencing. Is location. Is the accumulated knowledge of 15 years of standing in the batter's box against every kind of pitcher that the major leagues produced and filing all of it in the part of the mind that never stops working. Ruth had that knowledge. Had been collecting it for 15 years from the other side of the equation. And now he was using it from the mound. From the place where that knowledge translated differently. Where knowing what a hitter wanted not to see was more valuable than knowing what he wanted to hit. Second inning, third. The innings passed, and Ruth kept getting hitters out. Not easily, not dominantly. There were hard-hit balls. There were moments where the pitch didn't go where he wanted, and the hitter made him pay. But the line held. The runs didn't score. The game stayed close enough that the Yankees' offense could work with what Ruth was giving them. McCarthy watched from the dugout with an expression that documented the evolution of his thinking, from the skepticism that had attended the original idea, through the cautious optimism of the early innings, towards something that was beginning to look like genuine belief. Ruth was pitching, at 38. 15 years after anyone had seriously asked him to. Subscribe right now if you've ever watched someone do something they were told was behind them. Hit like if you already know how the ninth inning ended. And drop a comment. What is the most surprising thing you've ever watched an athlete do? Because what Ruth said when he came off the mound after the final out tells you everything about who he was. The middle innings were the innings where Ruth settled into what he was doing, found the rhythm that pitching requires, the specific rhythm of a man and a catcher communicating in signs, agreeing on what the situation calls for, executing the plan. His catcher was experienced, understood what Ruth had and what he didn't have and called the game accordingly. Did not call for pitches that Ruth's arm could not produce, called for the ones that Ruth could still execute, the location, the movement, the changing of speeds that disrupted timing in ways that velocity alone could not. Ruth threw what he was asked to throw, got the outs he needed to get, and the game moved toward its conclusion with the Yankees leading by a margin that Ruth's pitching had preserved. Seventh inning, eighth. Ruth was still on the mound. McCarthy had the bullpen available, had pitchers warming if the situation required it. Ruth knew this, knew that McCarthy would not sacrifice the game for the sentiment of watching Ruth pitch a complete game. Knew that the moment his stuff was gone, the moment the hitters were figuring him out and the runs were starting to score, McCarthy would come to the mound and the experiment would end. Ruth pitched to prevent that moment from arriving, managed his stuff, did not try to throw harder than his arm could produce, did not try to strike out every hitter, got outs, ground balls, fly balls, the occasional strikeout when the situation called for it. The pragmatic pitching of a man who understood that the goal was not to look impressive but to win the game. Ninth inning, 3 outs. Ruth on the mound. Yankee Stadium aware that something was about to conclude that they had not expected to see. 3 batters. Ruth faced them, got them out. The final out was recorded. The game was over. Ruth had pitched a complete game. 9 innings. At 38 years old. 15 years after his last serious pitching. He walked off the mound. McCarthy met him at the baseline. said something. Ruth said something back. What exactly they said is not recorded, but Ruth's expression, coming off the mound, was the expression of a man who has just done something he wasn't certain he could still do, and has discovered that he could. Not triumph exactly, something quieter. The specific satisfaction of a man who went back to a version of himself that he had put away and found it still there, still functional, still capable of the thing it had always been capable of, changed, slower, different from what it had been in 1918, but still there. He never pitched again, never asked to. The afternoon at Yankee Stadium was complete in itself, was not a beginning of something, was not the start of a new phase or a return to pitching as a regular part of his contribution to the Yankees. It was what it was. One afternoon, one complete game. One set of 9 innings, in which Babe Ruth remembered something about himself that 15 years of home runs had not erased. That he had been a pitcher before he was a hitter. That the arm that had thrown the ball for 2 years of his career had not forgotten what throwing felt like, even after 15 years of doing something else. That the knowledge he had accumulated from the other side, from the batter's box, watching pitcher after pitcher, filing everything, had translated back to the mound in ways that surprised even him. He won the game. He walked off the mound. He never went back. But for one afternoon in 1933, Babe Ruth stood on a pitcher's mound at 38 years old and did something that nobody in baseball had expected him to be able to do, and did it well enough to win. That was enough. That was always enough for Ruth. The thing done. The game won. The question answered. What more did you need?